Well, obviously, for some time now, I've been using video clips to certainly to help illustrate sermon points and so on, and that's all to the good. I think that's a worthwhile thing to do, or obviously we wouldn't be doing it, and generally it's been well received and so on. Little technical glitches here and there, but I'm trying to do more than that. I'm not just trying to illustrate sermon points when I use video clips like I will today. I'm trying to set a bit of an example about how Christians can use and be involved in the culture in which we live. The culture in which we live helps us to make connections with people. We can't be divorced as Christians from the culture in which we live because we're inevitably tied up with it. And I think sometimes, really unfortunately, Christians have a somewhat cynical, jaded view towards culture and all that stuff. I was talking to somebody about the video licensing thing, which we went through a big thing on showing the movie yesterday. And I said, well, I talked to the people from the Motion Picture Licensing Corporation. And they said, oh, why would you want to get involved with them? I'm like, come on. You know, as if culture were some sort of a dirty word, as if the arts were there was something wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it. And it's a good thing that God gives as common grace to his people. The culture in which we live is not necessarily good or bad. It's something that Christians can be involved in and use. So that's why I do this. And I think I'm following in good footsteps when we talk about Christians engaging people in the culture in which they live. It's not sufficient just to loudly or more loudly shout the gospel at the people with whom we live. And the reason why I say that is because Paul didn't do that. The scriptures don't lead us to do that. Jesus didn't do that. So where we get this idea that if we just speak more loudly at the people that we want to talk to, I'm not sure where it came from. So I want to look a little bit at this idea of engaging people in their culture and see how Paul did it. Okay, in the background to this passage today, Paul has been once again sent away by night. If you look in chapter 17, verse 10, Paul has been in Thessalonica, and as usual, he gets in trouble. There's a riot in the city. They come before the city officials shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have come here." And Jason has welcomed them into his house. They're defying Caesar's decree, saying there's another king, one called Jesus. And they hear this, and there's a big turmoil. And as soon as it was night, verse 10, as soon as it was night, the brothers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Now that happened to Paul all the time. We saw how when he went to Jerusalem, right after he was converted, he goes to Jerusalem, he starts preaching the gospel, there's an uproar, and they send him away by night. And the very next verse says, and the church in Judea, the church in Jerusalem enjoyed a time of peace. So whenever Paul leaves, there's peace. So it gives you something, an idea of his personality, that he was always being thrown out of places. And there's no need. I know that there are some people who look at that and say, see, that's what we should be like. Not necessarily. Just because the Bible reports something doesn't mean it's teaching us to be that way. There's a place in Acts 13 where Paul gets ready to set out on his second missionary journey. And he has a disagreement with Barnabas about John Mark. And Barnabas wants to take John Mark with them on their second missionary journey. He thinks he's a good help to them. And Paul says, no, he deserted us on our first missionary journey and didn't see it through to the end. We shouldn't take him. And it says there arose such a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas that they split up and went their separate ways. Now you'd be reading that wrongly to read, it's okay to have sharp disagreements with Christian brothers and go your separate ways and not be reconciled. That's not the message to take from that. And so it's not the message to take from this thing about Paul always getting into trouble, that we too should get into trouble and be abrasive like Paul. That's not the message to take. It's just to point out that's the way Paul was. He was a human being just like us. And he had his failures and so on just like we did. Anyway, that's the point. All that to say, they sent him away by night. He goes to Athens to wait for his traveling companions in Athens. And while he's there, he does what anybody would do. In the intellectual capital of the world of that day, he takes in the sights. He walks around the city, and he sees all of the temples and all of the beauty of the temples that are there. And it must have been an amazing sight. I mean, Athens today is an amazing sight, and it's ruins. Think about it, when they weren't ruins, when they were before urban development happened. Think about it when it was all what it was supposed to be. It had to have been an amazing sight. And so Paul takes in the sights. He goes around the city. As I mentioned, Athens was the world intellectual capital of that day. It was the cradle of democracy. A lot of historians think that the whole idea of democracy started in Athens, because that was where they first had a group of people that were elected, and that group of people helped govern the city. So instead of having one loudmouth tyrant who had all of the wealth or all of the power and just made people do what he wanted to do, they said, no, that doesn't work out very well. So let's have a group of people and put our minds together. So anyway, again, a short history lesson. That whole idea of democracy started in Athens. And so Paul's touring there. And he goes around the city. He sees all the temples and altars to the various gods. And he goes to the synagogues and he talks to the Jews about Jesus, of course. And it says that he was also out in the marketplace every day with those who were there. And he has conversation while he's out in the marketplace. So in other words, he doesn't just stay in the synagogue on the Sabbath. He goes uptown and he meets at Janelle's with the philosophers who are there. And he goes to the fair and he sees the philosophers on the Midway. And he talks to them. He talks to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in Athens. And they bring him to the Areopagus. This is an interesting thing. The Areopagus is a place and an institution. The Areopagus is called the Hill of Mars, or the Hill of Ares, which is the Greek term for Mars. And Mars and Ares were the gods of war. And so the Hill of Ares was where it was a hill dedicated to the god of Ares and Mars. And there was also a group of people who met there, and they had trials there. So the elders of the city, the elected officials of the city, would meet at the Areopagus, and they would have trials for really important things. Like if there was a murder trial, it would be brought up there. And if somebody came into the city preaching strange things, they wanted to make sure that this was an okay influence, and they heard Paul talking about Jesus and the resurrection. And some people think that they thought that he was preaching two gods, Jesus and Anastasis. And so they brought him before the Areopagus, the hill of the god of war. And Paul goes there to preach about the Prince of Peace. That's kind of a beautiful little way that works out, don't you think? So he goes there to the Hill of Ares to talk to this group of people that were the Areopagus about Jesus and explain himself. And I want you to notice that he's not, when he's there, giving a sermon. He's answering questions. They're inquiring of him what it is that he's preaching. And he's giving them an answer to these inquiries. So he's not been invited there to preach a sermon. It's kind of like he's going through not a trial, but like a little bit of an interview to see who it is that he is and what he's preaching. So they want to hear more about Paul and Jesus and the resurrection. And how Paul proclaims the gospel, I think, in this is instructive for us today. Because I know that there are many Christians, and probably some of us are among them, who feel increasingly alienated from the culture in which we live. I remember my dad saying, and my dad was not a barbarian by any means, but he never used to go to movies, not because he was a cultural barbarian, but because he said, I just don't share most of their values. So there you go. That's one way to handle it. But Paul is proclaiming, not in a sermon way, but just talking about the gospel. And notice how he starts in chapter 17, in the first verse that we had read today, verse 22. Paul then stood up in the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. Now, that's a non-threatening, non-judgmental statement. He's saying it with some approval. You're not atheists. I see that you're very religious. Look at all these temples. This is beautiful. You've got lots of gods. I see that you're religious. I see that you're serious about your religion. There's altars everywhere. He's not beginning a hellfire and brimstone sermon. He's establishing common ground with them. Guess what? I'm a religious person too. In fact, we're all religious people here. Isn't that great? That's kind of the way Paul is starting out here. I see that you're a religious person, that you're very religious. As I passed along, I saw an altar to the unknown God. Again, he's establishing common ground with them. I saw an altar. He's saying, not just in general, I see that you're religious, but I noticed some particular religious things. I noticed an altar that you have to the unknown God. That's significant. Because when he says the unknown God, he's talking about something that they would have known exactly what he was saying. There was a philosopher-poet named Epimenides who lived in the 6th century BC. And there's a historical account of him that would tie in nicely with the way Paul was talking to them. And the historical account went like this. In the 6th century BC, there was a plague that went through all of Greece. And they, the way that they thought in those days, they thought they must have offended one of the gods. And so they started offering sacrifices to the gods, which is what you do. You think you've offended your God, you try to make up for it, you do what they want you to do, you offer a sacrifice. Well, they kept offering sacrifices to the gods, to the gods of the gods, and the plague wasn't abating. And so Epimenides comes up with an idea. He says, look, let's set loose these hungry sheep. And hungry sheep will not lay down to rest because they're hungry. They'll just keep grazing. But if hungry sheep do lay down, that must be a sign from some God that we don't know that this is where we should offer a sacrifice. And so they set these sheep loose, and wherever the sheep stopped, they would kill the sheep and offer the sacrifice to the unknown God. And that was what that altar was for. It's not to an unknown God. It's not like our tomb of the unknowns, where we don't really know anything about it. They're just saying, look, here's a God that stopped this plague at one point. We don't know his name. We don't know who he is or who she is, for that matter. We don't know anything about it, so it's the unknown God. Paul says, I saw your altar to the unknown God. He goes, let me tell you, I know that God you're talking about. I know the God that stops plagues. I know the God that brings blessing to people. Let me tell you about him. You see what he's done there? He's established a rapport with these people that makes them think he's not a space alien dropped out from outer space telling about something completely bizarre. He speaks our language. He knows us. He knows how we think. He knows some of our culture. He knows the way things work. So anyway, Paul tells them, I saw the altar to an unknown God. He uses it as a bridge. And he starts to tell them about the unknown God. He says, let me fill in some of the blanks for you. So he tells them that the unknown God, remember, before I say this, remember, these people are pagans. When I say pagans, I don't mean that disparagingly. I mean, they're not Jewish. They hadn't been taught anything about the Judeo-Christian tradition. They didn't know any of that. So Paul says, let me fill in the blanks about this unknown God. In the first place, he's the creator of all things. He made the world and everything in it. And not only is he the creator, he's the Lord of all things. He still rules over all things. And they're probably thinking, wow, Ares is only the god of war. Zeus is the god of thunder and lightning. We got all these gods that are the gods of this and that, but your God, the unknown God, is the God of everything and everyone. So he's filling in the blanks for them about the unknown God. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples made by hand. That's interesting. We've invested a whole history and culture in building temples. But the unknown God doesn't live in a temple made by human hands. And in fact, not only does he not live in temples made by human hands, he's not served by human hands. He doesn't need us to bring sacrifices to him. He doesn't need us to get his will done. He doesn't need us to put in... See, sometimes idolatry was like a pop machine view of God. If you're going to get something out of Zeus, you got to sacrifice the right amount of sheep. And you got to say the right words. It's like putting coins in a pop machine. If you want to get the Coke, you got to put in $1.50. And if you put in $1.50, you'll get what you pay for. Paul is saying God's not like that. The unknown God is not served by human hands. He doesn't need what we have to offer him. Because he gives life. Let me see where it is. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all people life and breath and everything else. So you do a little calculation in your mind here. Think. Life, breath, everything else. What else is there? Can you think of anything else? Life, breath, everything else. He gives all people that. So what does he need from us? Nothing. Actually, it's we who need something from him. He doesn't need us. And I talked a couple Sundays ago about unity amongst Christians. And there are differences amongst Christians that shouldn't get in the way of our unity. But one of the things that is a difference is that some people seem to think that God is lost without us. That if he doesn't have us, his plans are just going to fall to the ground. He needs us to do things. You hear that all the time. People say, well, if we don't do it, it won't get done. Not necessarily. It may not get done through you, but it'll get done through somebody somehow, if it's what God wants done. God, I think we have to get this through our head somehow. God does not need us. We need him. And I think we tend to turn it around. I turn it around all the time. Part of the reason why I have sleepless nights about organizing big events is because if I don't do it, it's not going to happen. Oh, I'm all anxious about it. It's not the way it works. So, God does not need us. In fact, God is still involved in his creation. He's not sitting up on Mount Olympus somewhere with the gods, drinking and feasting and playing jokes on people. He's not a distant God far away. He's involved in the world because from one person he made every nation, and nation, as you know by now, is not national boundaries that we know today. It's people groups. From one person he made all people groups on the face of the earth, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. So Paul says, you see the world, the way the world is configured today? The Spartans live over here, and the Greeks live here, and the Nubians live down in Africa, and the Gauls live up in... God did all that. God arranges all of that. So he's not a distant God. He's involved in everything that happens on the face of the earth in the lives of his people. And he's not far from us. And he uses two more, in fact, cultural illustrations of their own culture to illustrate what he's saying. So, next, he uses Epimenides, the same guy, Epimenides. He quotes from one of his writings. And he says this. The second philosopher Paul quoted was Epimenides, who started his work entitled Critica. It's a poetic work written in the 6th century BC. Now listen to this and see why you think Paul might have picked up on this. Here's what the first couple of lines of the Critica written by Epimenides said. They fashioned a tomb for thee, O holy and high one, but thou art not dead. Thou livest and abidest forever. For in you we live and move and have our being. You see what he did there? He took a poet that was writing 600 years before this, that was part of their way that they understood the world, and he quoted something from it that said almost exactly what he was saying about Jesus, and made the point that it's in that one that we live and move and have our being. It's almost like saying, go see Gone with the Wind. Remember what Gone with the Wind says, fellas? Right there. And he quotes from Gone with the Wind, and they say, wow, that's amazing. That's what he's doing here. It's in him that we live and move and have our being. And then he goes on to say, again, a different poet this time. He goes on to quote another poet named Aratus, A-R-A-T-U-S, and he wrote a poem called the Phimenia, and this was only from like 100 years before when Paul was talking. And the Aratus begins this way. Let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street and every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and the harbor is full of his deity. Everyone, everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring. So he quotes that down in verse 28. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said. We are his offspring. Hellenistic Stoics that Paul was talking to, for them, Zeus was a name for a force which controlled the universe and resided everywhere, in everyone, and everything. In other words, for the Hellenistic Stoics, Zeus was not the angry god up on the mountain on Mount Olympus. Zeus was the life force that existed everywhere and in everyone. And Paul quotes that poet to make his point about God and about he's the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Paul's point is that their own culture points to what he's saying. God has not left himself without a witness. No matter where you go, no matter what you look at, I'm convinced that unless it's just out and out straight prurient, how do you say that word? Prurient? Pornography. Unless it's that's strictly for something other purpose. If it's a work of art, there's glimmers of God in it no matter where they're from. No matter who's writing it. No matter how much you might think, what? What's that person trying to say? If you think about it long enough and look at it long enough, you'll see. Because works of art are what people do to express themselves. They say something. They make an image, a statement. And in that, because, here's the key connection, because every human being is created in God's image, there's always going to be glimmers and rumors of glory everywhere you look. Everywhere you look. Even in the most crazy movie or crazy novel or crazy poem or crazy music, there's going to be something there that you can say, you know what? That's a reflection of God. Let me show you a video clip that does this. This is from a movie called The Frisco Kid, one of my favorite movies. And it's about a guy who is a Jewish rabbi traveling across the country. In the 1800s, they get captured by Indians. And the Indians steal his scroll of the Torah, and they want to know about his God. And in particular, the chief of the tribe that has them wants to know, does your God make rain? Because we're having a terrible drought, and things are really bad. So does your God make rain? And here's the way the Frisco Kid, the movie, shows that little interaction.
What God the Great Spirit not that's right. Wonderful! Wonderful and nice dancing. Nice does not make rain. Yes or no? Can your God make rain? Yes. But he doesn't. That's right. Why? Because that's not his department. But if he wanted to, he could? Yes. What kind of God do you have? Don't say my God. Is your God too? Don't give it to us. We have enough trouble with our own God. But there's only one God. What does he do? He can do anything. Then why can't he make rain? Because he doesn't make rain. He gives us strength when we're suffering. He gives us compassion when all that we feel is hatred. He gives us courage when we're searching around blindly like little mice in the darkness. But he does not make rain.
Anyway, you have to watch that whole thing to sort of appreciate it. But that's where you see, at least in a comical way, somebody trying to talk about God to people who don't really have a complete picture of God, but trying to talk about what God is like. And I think that we, as Christians, can use the culture. So here's what I want to say. Go see a movie. Go see a couple movies. Go get a good book and read it. Go get something on the New York Times bestseller list and read it. Go see a play. Go to all the musicals that Eastwood does. Since Dale doesn't seem to think we can get up the elevator, when the elevator's in, go to all the stuff at the Opera House and see the plays at the Opera House. It's a good thing. It's something that God made to be good, and it helps us establish contact and rapport with the people around us. And we can use it as we share the gospel with people who may not know very much about the gospel. But those things are all useful by God in our hands. Or maybe I should, yeah, that's right. They're all useful by God in our hands. Let's close in a word of prayer.